In March of 2012, a man climbed into a steel ball the size of a phone booth, sealed the hatch by hand, and let gravity pull him down into the dark. For 2.5 hours he fell, past the depth of the Titanic wreck, past the last traces of sunlight, and kept falling. When James Cameron finally touched the bottom, he was standing at the deepest place on planet Earth, alone. He hadn't spent 7 years and $10 million of his own money building a machine engineered specifically to survive that trip just to look at mud. He expected monsters. He got almost nothing. That's the part that should worry you, because almost nothing was hiding 4 things scientists are still trying to explain, and the first thing he saw wasn't even alive. The Mariana Trench isn't just deep. It's a different planet. At its lowest point, a slot in the seafloor called the Challenger Deep, the water is nearly 11 kilometers down. Take Mount Everest and drop it into that trench, the peak would still sit more than 2 kilometers underwater. No sunlight has ever touched that mud. The pressure is over 1,000 times what you feel standing on solid ground, like balancing a car on one fingertip pressed against every inch of your body at once. Before Cameron, exactly 2 people had ever seen it. In 1960, a Navy officer and a Swiss engineer rode a submersible called the Trieste to the bottom, stirred up so much silt they could barely see anything, and stayed 20 minutes. For 52 years, nobody went back. Then Cameron built the Deepsea Challenger, a 12-ton vertical torpedo with a pilot sphere so small he couldn't fully straighten his arms inside it, and went completely alone. No cable to the surface, no backup. If something failed on the way down, no rescue on Earth could reach him in time. When Cameron settled onto the seafloor, the first thing his lights picked out wasn't a creature. It was tracks, faint skid marks pressed into the mud, left by an earlier suburban of that same patch of trench. The first thing Cameron saw at the single deepest point on Earth was evidence that a machine had already been there before him. He didn't know it yet, but that wasn't going to be the last time. Beyond those tracks, the trench opened into exactly the desolation nobody expects from the most mysterious place on the planet. Flat, gray, featureless. He described it afterwards as looking like the surface of the moon. Bleak, lunar, one of the most isolated places he'd ever stood. No fish, no monsters, nothing that looked, to his eyes, alive. For a man who designed the creatures in Aliens and built the abyss around the idea of intelligence down here, coming face to face with an empty gray desert at the one place built to hide something extraordinary had to sting. Here's the actual discovery. He was wrong about what that emptiness meant. It was life so different from anything he expected that from inside that tiny sphere, he simply couldn't see it. His cameras were quietly picking up what his eyes couldn't. 3 hours into the dive, the sub he'd spent 7 years building started to fail. Hydraulic oil leaked inside the vehicle and smeared across his one small viewport. The thrusters on one side died, leaving him able to do little more than spin in place. His robotic arm, built to grab sediment and collect samples, stopped responding. He'd planned to spend up to 6 hours down there. He got roughly half of that. His life support stayed stable, but the mission he'd spent 7 years preparing for had just been cut short by machinery he'd designed himself. If the story ended there, it would read as one of the most expensive disappointments in the history of exploration. It didn't end there, because the real discoveries never came from Cameron's window at all. Alongside the sub, the expedition had lowered unmanned landers, weighted platforms carrying cameras and baited traps straight onto the trench floor. Scientists later spent months working through roughly 25 hours of that footage, frame by frame. Scattered across the dead mud, the cameras caught structures that looked almost architectural. Small honeycombed shells, some bigger than a dinner plate. For a while, nobody was sure what they were looking at. A colony maybe, some kind of coral. Each one is a single cell, one cell the size of your palm. Nearly every cell in the human body needs a microscope just to be seen. These things, called xenophyophores, are among the largest individual living cells ever found on Earth, in dense fields across the Challenger Deep. To build their shells, they filter and concentrate particles from the water around them, and testing has found them concentrating heavy metals, including uranium, inside their tissue. A single cell sitting in permanent darkness, quietly hoarding metal. And the mud wasn't empty even beyond that. That same top layer of sediment is thought to hold one of the densest concentrations of living material anywhere on Earth, almost entirely microbial, almost entirely unstudied. The expedition collected roughly 20,000 of them just to begin figuring out what they even are. The next discovery was harder to explain. The only living things Cameron said he actually noticed with his own eyes were a few pale, shrimp-like creatures drifting past his window. He barely gave them a second thought. Those are amphipods. Near the surface, small enough that you'd need tweezers to pick one up. On this expedition, scientists documented something extraordinary. Specimens at Challenger Deep reaching 17 centimeters, and separate specimens from the New Britain Trench, a different site studied on the same trip, estimated at nearly 30, roughly the length of your forearm. Almost every retelling collapses those two into one place. They weren't. Scientists call the phenomenon deep-sea gigantism, and it's one of the most extreme examples ever recorded, just spread across two different trenches, not one. Researchers studying the Challenger Deep amphipods found something else worth pausing on. A compound called skyloinositol being investigated at that exact time as a potential treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Something scavenging in total darkness under 1,000 atmospheres of pressure may be carrying chemistry that human medicine is still trying to understand. The deepest ocean isn't a desert, it's a waiting room. Survival belongs to whatever can wait the longest and eat the fastest when something finally falls. Months after Cameron surfaced, a researcher named Natalia Gallo sat down to comb through the raw footage frame by frame. She almost scrolled past what she found next. A faint disturbance in the smooth gray mud. Small gray shapes, roughly the size of a crayon, shaped like fat worms with feeding arms reaching into the current. Sea cucumbers, but ones that, as far as anyone can tell, don't match any known species. Here's what made her stop. They weren't scattered randomly. Every single one was facing the exact same direction, lined up like rows of soldiers, angled so the current would carry drifting food straight into their arms. They weren't hunting, they were letting the ocean deliver dinner to them. Other sea cucumbers on the same expedition were caught doing something almost nobody expected, lifting off the seafloor and swimming through the black water. Because Cameron's robotic arm had already failed, nobody could collect one. It's never been formally confirmed as a new species. It's still down there right now, and it still doesn't have a name. Here's the one that stays with people. Everything on this list is alien by definition. The pressure, the cold, the giant cells, the swarming shrimp, the unnamed creatures standing in attention in the current. It's about as far from anything human as you can physically get while still standing on this planet. While Gallo kept working through the footage, she found something else sitting in the mud. Not a creature, a discarded dive weight. Metal ballast likely dropped by an earlier deep submergence vehicle years before Cameron arrived. Remember those tracks from the very start of this video? The very first thing Cameron's lights picked out at the bottom? This is the second time, at the single deepest point in the entire ocean, in a place fewer people have physically visited than have walked on the moon, our equipment had already been there. Twice. Her team put it about as plainly as it can be put. Our presence in the ocean is now everywhere. James Cameron went to the bottom of the earth, hoping to find monsters. What he found was quieter and stranger than anything he could have written into a script. A landscape that looked dead and wasn't, cells the size of your hand hoarding heavy metal, chemistry that might help treat Alzheimer's, creatures standing in formation in total darkness, and proof, right there in the mud, that we'd already gotten there first, twice. The wider expedition also found thin microbial mats living on rock at nearby Serena Deep, feeding on chemical reactions in the stone itself, with no sunlight and nothing we'd normally call food. Chemistry that could resemble processes capable of supporting life in places sunlight never reaches, on this planet or possibly others. We have sharper maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. The deepest point on Earth has been visited by fewer people than have walked in space. Almost everything we now know about the Challenger Deep came from one submersible that broke down halfway through its mission, a handful of grainy footage, and a scientist willing to look closely enough to notice what a director missed. Whatever's actually down there, we've barely scratched the surface. If you want to see what else is hiding in the deepest places on Earth, the next one is already waiting for you.